Peace, family. It's your brother, Marc Lamont Hill. Welcome to the Marc Lamont Hill official YouTube channel. And also welcome to Night School every single night here, Monday to Friday, here on the Marc Lamont Hill official YouTube channel. We break down the biggest events, the most powerful and compelling ideas. We have important debates and rigorous conversations. It is not a TV show. It is not a podcast. It is a global classroom. And tonight, we have a lot of ground to cover, and we have a wonderful special guest who's going to help us cover it. Today is May 15th, and May 15th is an extraordinary moment in the history of the Palestinian liberation struggle. It is a low moment. It is a dark moment. It is a moment known as the Nakba. The Nakba was the day 76 years ago when more than 750,000 Palestinians had been expelled, either forcibly removed or chased away by Zionist militias, making them permanent refugees and clearing the way for the formation of the apartheid state of Israel that we know today. Palestinians all around the world commemorate the Nakba as a day of loss, as a day of mourning, as a day of catastrophe. But it's also, in many ways, an opportunity to have critical engagement, rigorous analysis, and thoughtful reflection on what a liberation struggle has been and what a liberation struggle can be. And tonight, I want to use the 76th anniversary of the Nakba as an opportunity to talk about what's going on in the Palestinian struggle today, to talk about what's happening on college campuses all around the country and indeed around the world in response to the current crisis in Gaza. In fact, it's a genocide in Gaza. And I also want to talk about the law a little bit. What does it mean to even think about or appeal to the law as a way of fixing not just the problems of Palestine, but maybe the problems around the world? So I couldn't think of anybody better to have on than Professor George E. Bisharat. He is a professor. In fact, he is the Honorable Raymond L. Sullivan Professor of Law at the University of California, San Francisco Law School. He is a brilliant scholar of law. He also holds a PhD in anthropology. He's a scholar of Middle East studies. He's written widely and broadly. He has a very prominent presence in the public sphere. I sometimes find myself cheering for him on TV and yelling and kicking and throwing things at the TV screen when the hosts aren't so nice to him. George, it's good to see you, my friend.
Thank you so much, Mark. I feel your solidarity all the time.
Let's start with Nakba Day. What does it mean 76 years later to be talking and thinking about the Nakba?
Well, you know, as you have said, Mark, the term Nakba in Arabic means catastrophe. And when we say a Nakba or the Nakba, we're referring to the expulsion, the forcible, violent displacement of Palestinians in the period around May 15th, 1948. It actually, the massacres and the expulsions started in late 1947, and they didn't really stop until even as late as 1950. And it was sort of the period of the destruction of Palestinian society in order to make way for the creation of a Jewish state with a strong Jewish majority. Now, I will say that if the essence of the Nakba was forced or violent displacement of Palestinians in favor of Jewish settlers, we have since come to realize over time. I mean, there was a book written very shortly after the Nakba, the original Nakba. It was called, the title of it was Ma'na Nakba, the meaning of the Nakba, and it was written by a Syrian Arab nationalist historian by the name of Constantine Zurek. And he was trying to figure out what it was that had led to this disaster. You know, what were the weaknesses in Arab society that permitted this to happen? And he focused on that particular, event. And that's how it was thought of for a long time. But again, if this forced displacement of Palestinians is really kind of the essence of the Nakba, we have now come to realize, and I think it is a more common understanding today among Palestinians, that the Nakba has never stopped. The forced displacement of Palestinians goes on today. It goes on in a variety of different forms. It's going on in the West Bank with the, with the actions of racist, ethno-nationalist settlers who are attacking, killing, burning, killing the livestock of Palestinians and driving them from their lands in the West Bank. And needless to say, it's occurring in the most grotesque form, in the form of a genocide and mass displacement of Palestinians in Gaza. So, it is this long-term process of the displacement of Palestinians that has never ended. It's taken different forms, and it's been, it's occurred at a faster and slower rate over time. I will say, I'm glad you pointed out that it is also an opportunity for reflection and analysis. And I think one thing that Palestinians today realize about the Nakba is that it is also a unifying force among us. It is what we all have experienced in one way or another. Now, how we have, there's no Palestinian family that hasn't been impacted by the Nakba, by forced displacement. How we have experienced it is different according to where we lived in the country, what social class we came from, what our capacities and resources were, and more. But it is what binds us together. It is the defining feature of Palestinian experience.
I hear the debates now. They've gone on forever. The talking points, the debates, the straw men, all the arguments about how the Nakba happened, why the Nakba happened. But in this new moment of sort of re-energized focus on Palestine, I'm starting to hear the old narratives again, which are that Palestinians had an opportunity for a state from the beginning. The Palestinians have consistently rejected any opportunity to have a self determination project fulfilled, and even that the Nakba itself, that displacement of Palestinians from 1947 through 1949, was not primarily the product of Zionist militias or violent expulsion, but simply sort of Arab arrogance, people leaving and saying, we'll come back after we dispense of the Zionist armies in a few days. That it was Arab leadership and the failures of Arab leadership throughout the 1940s and 1930s and 1940s that led to where Palestinians are now, and not this violent settler colonial ethno-nationalist project known as Israel that did it.
Yeah, that's right. I am hearing those, the resurgence of those debunked arguments again. We just have to go back to history and the facts to understand that they are, the reality is that when Israel was founded, the Jews of Palestine were about 1/3 of the population. The Palestinians were 2/3, and this was after years and years and years. Well, at least roughly 3 decades of the British mandate, sort of fostering Jewish immigration into Palestine, right? So it is true that Palestinians, as soon as the Zionist movement began, almost from its very inception in the late 19th century, Palestinians understood it to be a threat, perceived it to be a threat. And it was, the Zionist movement, the movement to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. There were other variants of the Zionist movement that didn't necessarily focus on sovereignty, but the dominant one, and the one that prevailed over time, was that which sought state sovereignty. Palestinians saw this as a threat to what was to them a natural Arab society in which they had been the majority of, better than 90% for centuries at a minimum. Um, Now, the Zionist movement tried very hard to establish a land base for Jewish settlement, but by the 1948 war had purchased and gained access to only about 6% of the land of of Palestine. And the Zionist planners understood very well that they could not have a strong Jewish state, predominantly Jewish state, if there were a large Arab minority within it. So, it was to the Palestinians, by their demography, by their numbers, by their geography, that is, by their ownership and control of most of the land, they were an obstacle to the creation of a Jewish state. So their expulsion had to happen for Israel to be created. There was just really no other way it could have happened. And it did happen, and it was planned, and it was deliberately executed by Zionist militias and later the Israeli Defense Forces. And there is that old canard about how Arab generals ordered Palestinians to flee so that they could sweep in and drive the Jews into the sea. This is all the further we go, the more and more these ideas are debunked. Now, it was very early on determined that there were no, it was supposedly done by radio broadcast, these orders for the Palestinians to flee. Well, it turns out that, the BBC monitored all radio broadcasts throughout the region, throughout the Middle East, and careful review of the transcripts of those records show that Arab governments were exhorting Palestinians to stay, not to leave, but to stay. There were a few cases where Jewish community leaders suggested to Palestinians or urged Palestinians not to flee, but there were as many as perhaps 70 massacres that occurred during this time period, some of which preceded the establishment of the State of Israel. One of the most notable occurred at Deir Yassin on the outskirts of current-day Jerusalem, where better than 100 Palestinian civilians were slaughtered, basically, by a Zionist militia. And the news of that was spread via what Menachem Begin, one prime minister of Israel in the 70s, referred to 70s and early 80s as a whispering campaign. In other words, the news of the massacre was spread throughout Palestine, and it was understood by Palestinians that this would be their fate if they did not flee. And as I said, there were as many as 70 such massacres, although historians differ on the precise number. And 15,000 Palestinians were killed during the Nakba. And of course, their villages were razed. Many of the hundreds of their villages, somewhere between 500 and 600 of their villages, were destroyed. If any Palestinians tried to infiltrate back to harvest their olives or to gather their livestock or whatever, they were shot on sight. Thousands of Palestinians were killed trying to come back into the country. So the forced displacement of Palestinians was all according to plan. It was according to military orders. There was a transfer committee that not only sort of planned how Palestinians should be displaced, but also the elements of the propaganda campaign that should follow to just to argue to the world that Palestinians shouldn't be able to return. So we have the receipts. In other words, it's all been proven. Actually, there's a recent interesting book that came out by an Israeli scholar called, I think it's called Dear Palestine by Shai Hazkani. And it turns out that it was, if you look at the sort of both the propaganda and then the private letters of, militia people on both sides, because of course there was Palestinian resistance too. It was in fact that the Jewish propaganda and leadership that was arguing for driving the Palestinians into the sea. And in fact, there were Palestinians who were driven into the sea. There were many Palestinians who fled via small boats and the like, either to Lebanon or to the Gaza Strip. So, unfortunately, we have to pull out those receipts again and show them yet again. Many of these myths that had been constructed around Israel's foundation had been substantially debunked by starting in the late 80s into the early 90s by a group of Israeli historians referred to as revisionist or new historians. Now it seems we have to go back to their work and remind people of its validity.
It's interesting because the new historians, people like Benny Morris and Avi Shlaim and Ilan Pape and others, some of them, particularly Benny Morris, I'm thinking about, is not what you'd call a progressive.
No,
Benny Morris participated in the Israeli. He was an IDF soldier and a proud one.
Yeah.
And while he supports the idea of transfer, he nonetheless concedes that transfer was a necessary component of the formation of Israel.
Yes.
And so Israel's leading historians are very clear in saying this state doesn't get formed unless, for the reason you described, hundreds of thousands or, unless there's a demographic majority here.
Yeah. Benny Morris actually believes that the transfer was not sufficiently complete.
Right.
It would have been better had a greater proportion, or perhaps all of the Palestinians had been expelled.
Right. Yeah. Which the Israeli argument is, if we were trying to expel people, same argument they make now in Gaza. If we were doing a genocide, if we were really trying to ethnically cleanse, we had the capacity to get rid of everybody. This proves that we weren't doing that. That this was just one of those things that happens in the course of war. This is one of those things that happens in the course of state formation.
Yeah.
From a cultural perspective, before we move on, what does the Nakba mean culturally to Palestinians in terms of thinking about this idea of relocation, dispossession? I was thinking, I've spent years now in Jerusalem, mainly doing field work, but I spent some time in Tulkarem, and I noticed when I got to Tulkarem refugee camp, there are people who are fourth generation Tulkarem refugee camp.
Yeah.
You ask them where they're from, they say, I live in Tulkarem. I am from Wadi al Hawadith. I am from I'm from 48 and I'm here. There's a sense of belonging and connectedness to something that may never be returned to them. In the most literal form, like you may never move back into that house. You may never go back to that precise village.
Yeah.
How important is it, and why is it important to have that connection to not just to the land, but to a very specific idea of home?
Well, I don't think Palestinians are unique in their attachment to land and to home. I think that's a pretty common thing, especially people who, Palestine was primarily an agrarian society up until the mid 20th century, and when you cultivate olive trees that are hundreds, some of them maybe even thousands of years old, and that's your family legacy. That's your great grandfather and your grandfather and grandmothers, and families have tended these groves and these trees for ages. Of course, you're going to feel connected to that land, and it really sort of defines your identity. And of course, Palestinian society is not monolithic. There are, regional identities, regional dialects, differences in food and that sort of thing. So people have their, yes, we're all Palestinians. And by the fact that we have all experienced the Nakba in one way or another, and the fact that we've all confronted settler colonialism in one way or another, we're unified, but we also have our specific characteristics. You've been around Palestinians enough to know, Mark, and you've traveled there extensively. That the people from Al Khalil, from Hebron, have a particular reputation, identity, whatever, and so does everybody. From
Yeah.
all different regions. The Ghazawis, the people from Gaza, have particular tough, strong, resilient, resistant, identity, which many of us admire. So all of those are deep, dear aspects of identity, and they come from long connection to the land.
Mm. In the last 7 months, the world's attention has been focused on Gaza, maybe in a way that we've never seen before.
Yeah, definitely.
I am always uneasy sort of asking Palestinians to sort of make a moral or even political assessment of Hamas because of the uses to which such analyses are put.
Right.
But what I would ask you is sort of how do you make sense of the last 7 months in relation to the struggle for Palestinian liberation?
Well, it's been an immense sacrifice. I mean, that I realize is a vast understatement. It's been a period of incredible suffering.
Hmm.
Obviously, first and foremost for the people there. Nothing that any of us on the outside. I felt it very strongly. My kids feel it very strongly. Every Palestinian family is transfixed by what's going on and is in deep pain. But it is nothing compared to what the people on the ground are actually facing and experiencing and struggling with. It is oddly, very, very ironically, also a period of hope.
Hmm.
I have been engaged in, working for justice and equality and peace in Palestine since I was a pre-teenager, or maybe an early teenager, right? And I'm now almost 70, so more than 50 years, and primarily in the United States. And I've never seen a period like this in my life when so many people have come out for Palestine. And there's nothing, there's no foregone conclusion. There's no inevitability to the change that I see. It can fizzle. It can be defeated. We're up against incredible power. But I haven't seen anything as inspiring and hopeful as I'm seeing in the young people who are in the encampments and people just all over the place, not just on college campuses, but a lot of people. And I think we could be, if we all put our shoulders to it together and don't let up, we could be on the cusp of some major positive change. It's not going to happen easily. It's not going to happen soon. It's not going to happen without struggle. But I see Adam Khaled saying the apartheid regime is unsustainable. I agree with you, and I also think that I think that Israel itself has been deeply uh, weakened
Hmm.
by what's happened. Mainly sort of politically and psychologically.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Everybody,
Yeah.
if you're coming in the room, more and more people are coming into this live stream. I'm joined by George Bisharat, who is a professor at the University of California, San Francisco Law School. He is a longstanding scholar and also activist voice for the Palestinian liberation struggle. And we're talking tonight about what it means to think about Palestinian liberation on Nakba Day, but also against the backdrop of 7 months of campus protests, decades of political struggle, and also an international, I would argue, commitment and faith in the capacity maybe of international law to fix some of this stuff. We're going to go there and talk about just how powerful or unimportant, insignificant, impotent international law might be at certain times. But I want to make sure we had that conversation as well. We're talking about sort of the last 7 months, and obviously now we see a death toll that is astronomical. As of today, 35,233 people have been killed.
Yeah.
79,141 have been wounded in Israeli attacks on Gaza since October the 7th. That's not counting the 8,000 who lay under rubble. That's not counting
Right.
many other people who probably have not been reported. Contrary to what the Israeli Hezbollah would have you believe, the Gaza Health Ministry numbers are actually quite conservative. They're not exaggerated based
Yeah.
on every historical indicator that we have.
Right.
But it seemed to me that the international solidarity that we've seen, the global outcry, didn't start as the death toll got to the tens of thousands. It seemed that by the end of October, there was a considerable global outcry in
Yeah.
response to Israel's response to October 7th.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
Mm-hmm.
this isn't the first time Israel has struck. We saw this with Operation Protective Edge, Operation Cast Lead. Before that, we've seen numerous Israeli military incursions that have been violent and bloody. Why do you think this one garnered so much attention, so much outrage, and such an international kind of solidarity movement formed out of it?
Well, I do think it is qualitatively and quantitatively worse than we've seen in the past. I mean, I think Operation Protective Edge in 2014, 2013, 2014 killed 2,251 Palestinians thereabouts. So, you know, the death toll since October 7th, I mean, just in the first few weeks of the war had exceeded that
That's
number.
fair.
Um, so I think that's part of it. Uh, I also think that the Israeli government was very sort of brazen about its genocidal intent. Um, the statements that were coming out that were very frank, very honest. Uh, were shocked the world. You know. We're used to Israeli leaders in the past, who have couched and rationalized, their actions in somewhat more urbane terms. This was crass. It was obvious. Just grotesque, frankly.
Yeah.
I think that was also a factor, and I think Israel, with its rightward turn, with the year-long dispute over judicial reform, had already weakened its image in the global North. In other words, there were many people, even friends of Israel in the United States, who were deeply alarmed over the changes that they thought they saw in Israel when the illiberal tendencies of this current government that would circumscribe the rights of Jewish Israelis, not just Palestinian Israelis. I mean, the abridgment of Palestinian rights had gone on forever without arousing a whole lot of concern, but there was this skepticism about the current Israeli government that had developed not in direct relation to the attack. But when we had this extreme racist, ethno-nationalist government and these extreme genocidal, obviously genocidal statements coming from them, Um, I think that triggered a response that we wouldn't have seen and did not see in the past.
Last week, there was a glimmer of hope when Joe Biden publicly announced that he would not be sending any weapons. This was the first week where no munitions were sent to Israel. And he said, as
Yeah,
long as these pieces, as long as this weaponry was going to be used in a ground invasion in Rafah, which has been universally recognized as a human rights debacle, human rights crisis, perhaps that we've never seen before in the region. Um, if there's a ground invasion, that is to say, uh, in the back against the backdrop of all that, Biden said, "Hey, enough," and people said, "Hey, maybe the United States has had enough." Even though we've well armed Israel, we provide the money, the weapons, the global support, the advocacy, the shielding in the UN at the UN Security Council. America's complicit at every level, but at some point, you can have the capacity to say enough. And America finally reached its boiling point. I gotta say, George, there was a part of me that said, even if it's for cynical political calculus,
yeah,
Biden knows he needs progressive votes, he needs student votes, he needs young people
hmm
votes, he needs
hmm
brown votes. He's
yeah,
going to stop sending weapons to Israel. They got enough anyway, at least for a little bit.
yeah.
That was
Didn't
like
last long.
that was a Tuesday.
Yeah,
And then
yeah,
yesterday, I see $1
yeah.
billion in aid. What the heck happened? How do you make sense of that?
Well, I mean, it's the political calculus that you're right. I think I think the Biden campaign is betting on the fact that that progressives and his critics don't have a political home to go to, and they they will eventually come home because of the fear of of electing Trump, who might only be worse. Although that's speculative, I would have to say.
Yeah.
Whether he would in fact have been worse in these circumstances, I cannot really state with certainty.
What would
Um,
worse look like? I mean, I get Trump being worse on the issue in the broad sense. He cut UNRWA before a war. There was a
yeah,
war.
right, right,
He acknowledged the Golan. He,
right.
stopped signing the waiver for the Jerusalem Embassy Act. But it's like that's just American foreign policy on steroids. He's generally the same template. I don't know in this moment what Donald Trump could have done that would be any different or any worse than what Joe
Yeah,
Biden did. Because I can't think of anything Joe Biden did that mitigated Israel's harm.
yeah. I'm not sure that he would have done differently in a way that would have been felt differently by the people on the ground. Although it could have been worse. It could have been, like his buddy um, Lindsey Graham, level the place.
Right.
You know,
Hiroshima,
it could have been
Nagasaki.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. In any case, back to your question about what's going on with this, disapproval of a few bombs here and there, and then authorizing $1 billion of aid a couple days later. I think it's a fundamental calculus that there's that critics of his policy have no political option, no electoral option, and people will eventually come back. And he's satisfying a lot of really important powers, everybody from the arms industry to
Mm,
wealthy donors to the Democratic Party.
yeah.
So not to mention, I actually, when Joe Biden says, I am a Zionist, as he has said repeatedly over the years, I take him at his word.
Yeah.
He's a Zionist.
He-
And,
he-
needless to say, what I hear when he says that is, I am a racist.
mm,
That's what I hear.
yeah.
I value Jewish lives. And that's great. I personally, me, George, and now I'm speaking, I value Jewish lives. But I also value Palestinian lives, and I value them no less than I value Jewish lives. And I think that, you know, his own aides, Biden's own aides, have commented on what they see as an empathy gap,
Mm,
between his empathy for, Jewish victims of October 7th, a very human response, and his relatively cold response, actually, to his mouthing of Israeli talking points about, beheaded babies, and doubting the statistics that come out from the actually quite, as you pointed out, historically reliable Palestinian health ministry in the Gaza Strip. All of those things show, he doesn't really care much about Palestinian lives.
yeah, that's a very scary thing. One group of people that does care about Palestinian lives increasingly is college students.
Yes.
Uh, for the last few months, we have seen encampments pop up on universities. We've seen
Yeah.
marches, protests, walkouts.
Hmm.
We probably haven't seen anything like this since the Iraq War, and before that, maybe the Vietnam War. What do you make of this campus protest movement among students, and also the university's equally powerful commitment to stopping it?
Well, two things. So first of all, from the young protesters, I see, a beautiful act of love and of humanity, and it's incredibly inspiring. Um, and I also think that what this is, it is, of course, a protest against what's going on in Gaza, but it's also a protest against the utter corruption and misguidedness of our politicians, our political class, our media, on this and so many other issues. I think that people are seeing this struggle as emblematic of many other struggles as well, and that's incredibly powerful. And it's also deeply moving to me as a person who, like I said, I've been with this issue in this country for, better than 50 years. I've never seen anything like this. um, the res- the response, the repressive response, we're in the era of the neoliberal university, in which, the administrations take their orders from their wealthy donors.
Oh yeah,
I mean, it's really, as far as I'm concerned, it's really just that simple.
I think you're right. When I got fired from CNN, I also got called into the administration's office at Temple University, where I was a tenured professor with an endowed chair. And the most striking thing wasn't the fact that they met with me that morning and said, "Hey, something's going to happen to you. We're either going to fire you, take away your chair, suspend you, censure you, or do nothing. And we promise you we're
Wow.
not going to do nothing."
Wow.
And so I had to wait like the entire day to find out that I'd been censured
Yeah.
by the university, which
Mhm.
was stunning. I was the first person, I believe, in the university's history to be censured,
Mhm.
and the board of the chair of the board of trustees said that he had never seen an act of of just a moral transgression like mine before. Um, that he, by the way, was the personal attorney of Bill Cosby, who also is an alum of Temple University. Um, Interesting factoid. But what more interesting though was a few months later when the dust settled a bit, and the president and provost called me into their office and said, "We don't necessarily think you're anti-Semitic, and after talking to you and now studying River to the Sea, we understand that you're not anti-Semitic.
Mhm.
Uh, but we still haven't been able to fully calculate the amount of donations we've lost and the amount of wills that we're
Yeah.
no longer written into.
Yeah.
So we'd like you to think about how you can possibly compensate the university and make us whole for all of the financial losses that we've incurred because of you speaking out."
Oh my God. Oh.
So
Well, there you
just
have
give you
it.
a concrete kind of example,
There
or
you
even one
have it.
example of what you're talking about.
At
It
least
was
they were being
purely
honest with you.
it was. I wish they lied a little bit. You know,
Yeah,
Lemmy
I
Giovanni said,
know.
lie to me a little bit. I
That's
was actually
amazing.
shocked. It was sobering.
Yeah.
Like they were
Yeah,
like,
that's
look, this isn't
amazing.
about Palestine or Israel or anti-Semitism at this
Yeah.
point. It's about we got a business to run.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there are, of course, committed Zionists in these, in these institutions. So I don't want to overlook the ideological component,
Right. For
but
sure.
basically, I do think it's primarily about about bucks, um, and I think that it's about, it's about bucks. It's not just about private donations. It's also about this sense of vulnerability to the withdrawal of federal funding, with it being such the sort of the pro-Israel um, sentiment is still highly bipartisan. Yes, there are a few Democrats now who are sort of questioning our policies and aren't going along with all of the pro-Israel dictates, but most of them still are. And we've seen any number of initiatives to, whether it's to institutionalize the IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, and to apply that, in the allocation of federal funding and that sort of thing. All of these, I think, are factors in the university's responses.
So that's a great pivot to the last thing I wanted to ask you about, which
Yeah.
is the power of internet, not just international law, but let's just say the law more broadly. I mean, you just gave the
Hmm.
example of the IRA definition. And for those that don't know, that's the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. They, the person who constructed that definition of anti-Semitism, ironically said this shouldn't be used or
Yeah.
codified in law. That's not what the
Right.
purpose of it was.
Yeah.
But there are multiple ways that anti-Semitism has been defined under the IRA definition, from things that we may all agree with, like anti-Semitic caricatures or Holocaust denial, or maybe even double standards against Israel, although that's a more complicated and messy one. Um, but then there are things like uh, challenging Israel's right to self-determination, and the example they give for that one is
Yeah.
saying that the construction or the creation of the state of Israel is a racist endeavor. I'm doing this off the top of my head, so I might not be word for word, but
Right.
basically saying that
No,
the
I.
formation of Israel is a
Yeah.
racist endeavor, or comparing Israel to, or the actions of the state practices or actions of Israel to that of Nazi Germany.
Right.
So under the IRA definition, at least three things that George and I have talked about today would be considered anti-Semitic. So if we had this conversation on a university stage, as opposed to on YouTube, the university could lose funding. There could be charges brought up, and we could lose our jobs. I mean, by the IRA definition, Hannah Arendt, one of the great Jewish American scholars, one of the scholars of genocide and Holocaust, and certainly no one would call Hannah Arendt an anti-Semite by any, or even a self-hating Jew by any stretch. But nevertheless, Hannah Arendt comparing the actions of a Zionist militia against an Arab village to a Nazi soldier would be an act of anti-Semitism by virtue of
Yeah.
the IRA definition. The reason why I'm bringing this all up is because this is no longer just a really bad, overly expansive definition of anti-Semitism being wielded by the ADL. If the Senate approves this, and I suspect they will, the House has already approved it, we're going to see this as federal law. And to your point, George, the universities, K-12 education, a high school teacher can't talk about maybe can't talk about the Deir Yassin massacre in the way
Hmm. Hmm.
that you might need to be historically accurate. The
Hmm.
law is going to actually reinforce and protect political Zionism.
Yeah.
Um, is the law first, what do you make of sort of the legal realm in terms of how the struggle for Palestinian self-determination in general has been playing out over the
Mhm.
years. But
Mhm.
specifically at this moment, is the law an asset? Is it an ally?
Well, so I'm going to say a couple of things. So I'll start off with my general adage, which is that law is where power announces its victories.
Mm.
And
Oh,
what I
excellent.
mean by that is, courts basically follow political power. They do not determine political power. They mostly are a reflection of the political circumstances in which they operate. And uh, and 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 so anybody who expects law to any person who lacks power, or any group that lacks power and expects law to come to their rescue, is going to be waiting quite a long time, perhaps forever. And so, in that sense, what the protesters on the university campuses and out in the streets are doing is actually much more important, at least as a primary. What they are doing is formulating and exercising political power. Now it's a complex form. When civil disobedience evokes a response, and it's not always a positive response, and that sort of thing. And it's not an easy path to take, but formulating and exercising that power is actually a prior step to achieving victories in courtrooms, in my experience uh, and belief. Um, so that's kind of how now the other thing that I wanted to say is, though, that if you don't find the law, this is my other adage, the law will find you.
Mm.
In other words, and the law is finding us. Like, if when you talk about this legislation coming down the pike, and I hope you're wrong about the Senate, by the way. I know that there are a few sane people in the Senate, and a few people who, and actually, as you probably are aware, there is some political opposition from the right to
Yeah.
this as
Oh, yeah.
well.
Even Marjorie Taylor Greene was like, "Hey, wait a
Yeah.
minute.
Yeah.
My
We,
anti-Semitism, my
yeah.
anti-Semitic Christian nationalism is bumping into this."
Exactly. Yeah. So we don't know exactly what's going to transpire with that. But the point is that while nobody should stake their hopes in, while people who are marginalized and oppressed cannot stake their hopes in the law. They cannot afford to abandon the field of law, because
Mhm.
it will come out after you and find you and further oppress you. So, it's a field, in I see it as secondary to political struggle and what goes on in the streets, but important and necessary. And it's something that I urge people to do. I was a law professor teaching people to do this stuff, uh, because I thought it was worthwhile, not wasting my life. Um,
Do you feel the same way
but
about international law? I mean, every law professor I've ever spoken to says, "Well, it's not really a real thing."
Well, it is a real thing. It's just not the same as domestic law. It is more a form of discourse, and but it's a discourse that's important and influential, and that we cannot afford to ignore. That would be, I mean, now I do think that we're actually at a critical point in, I mean, I would say, since World War II was kind of the big event you know that everybody responded to. It was, not international law didn't start with World War II, but it was, in the aftermath of World War II, we had the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We had the Genocide Convention. We had the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. We had, the development of international humanitarian law, which protects civilians in times of war, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a big sort of, and the whole concept of human rights and NGOs defending human rights around the world. All of these things were post World War II developments. I think we're at a turning point where people have seen the hypocrisy and the weaknesses and the dysfunction of international law and international institutions, and we could be at a point of people, throwing up their hands and saying, "Screw it." I mean, we're not going to take this interpretation of international law. Actually, what the U.S. calls it, what our leaders call it, they don't refer to international law. They refer to the international rules-based order.
Yes.
and you get, what is that? What are they talking about? The international rules-based orders. They don't say international law. They
Why?
don't, because they know that it's not international law and that it is basically a construction of their own ideology and their own sort of projection of U.S. interests, of U.S. Imperial interests. That's really what it is. It's kind of, China is threatening the the international rules-based order in its sort of aggressive act in the South China Sea. Well, we aren't signatories of the Law of the Sea Convention, so we can't say, oh, they're violating international law, because we haven't even signed the damn thing.
Right.
So obviously the Antony Blinken bemoans attacks on hospitals in the Ukraine, as well he should. And about Gaza, we're concerned. We're very concerned.
Right.
We have we've expressed our concern, and we're consulting with the Israelis to see if they're targeting, and all that kind of. We're providing them actually intelligence on targeting so that they can avoid hitting civilians. That's their approach in the Gaza Strip. So, I mean, there are 3 cases before the International Court of Justice that relate to Palestine. There's South Africa versus Israel, which in their hearings tomorrow on a new request for provisional measures in that case, tomorrow and Friday. There's Nicaragua versus Germany. Nicaragua charging Germany with complicity in Israel's genocide. And then there's the General Assembly request for an advisory opinion on the legal consequences of Israel's long-term occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, amounting to what many people believe is a system of apartheid. And I really do think that the International Court of Justice, its credibility is on the line with these 3 cases. And its rulings actually, have been somewhat encouraging. I mean, if you go back to 2004, in the Wall case, the International Court of Justice was kind of incredible in its judgment in finding that the Israeli separation barrier was illegal and should be dismantled, and it voted that way by an overwhelming majority. As I recall, the numbers were, there were 15 regular judges on the court, and the votes were like 13-2 and 14-1 on almost all of the points of law that they voted on.
Does it matter? How much does it matter, though, right? Because that's my word.
That's right. That decision has. I mean, it was the decision that actually, or it was the lack of response, the lack of enforcement of that of that ICJ decision on the Wall in 2004 that led to the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions in 2005. by 171 Palestinian civil society organizations. So it had that consequence. It didn't have a direct legal consequence. You're right. And this is, of course, the weakness of the international legal system. The only enforcement, the only direct enforcement, if individual countries don't take it on their own initiative to enforce and to abide by the judgments of the International Court of Justice, it's up to the United Nations Security Council to enforce that judgment. And of course, what the issue there is. It's, the US. It's not like other countries don't also exercise vetoes, but the United States, in respect of Israel,
We have a
is
singular
the one.
commitment.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like The Godfather. We're like Tom Hagen. Like we have one client.
Yeah. Yeah.
I know you have to run. There was a quick question here from the audience here. One was from Bullet the Bunny, who's doing amazing work with doctors in Gaza right now. Who said, "Is Egypt aligning with South Africa on ICJ case an American proxy trap, a distraction to finish the job?"
I'm not sure I understand how it would be so. I don't see it that way. I think Egypt has its own interests in mind in joining the case on South Africa's side. Its interest is in preventing the Palestinian refugees being pushed out of the Gaza Strip into Egypt itself. Egypt has a complicated relationship with Palestinians, with the Gaza Strip, with Hamas, but just to summarize it, I would say that Israel, generally speaking, sees Palestinians as trouble and doesn't want more Palestinians in Egypt spreading their trouble to other Egyptians.
Right.
So that, I think, is the main. It's a signal to Israel, I think, of how serious the Egyptians are about not wanting to be hosts of more Palestinian refugees.
Yeah, and I suspect they don't do this if not for the pending invasion of Rafah. They sat on their hands the entire time.
That's right.
1.5 million people in Rafah with a ground invasion means you're getting people in the Sinai. I mean, it seems unavoidable, and I think that's what they're trying to avoid. And then the last question we had from someone is a very simple one. It's a great way to to me, it's a hopeful question on Nakba Day to ask. Do you see an end to this?
Well, it depends on what you are referring to as the current conflict. If you're talking about what's going on, the military operation in the Gaza Strip right now, it is going to end. I don't know when it's going to end. It may be soon. It could be weeks away, or it could be months and months away. I don't have a crystal ball, and I'm not able to foresee the future, but it will come to an end. As to the bigger struggle, for justice and equality in Palestine, I'm actually optimistic about that too. I think that one is probably a couple of decades away, but I will also mention that, change, once it gets rolling, change can happen very quickly. We've already seen a lot of change happen in this country. And, one of the things that I notice is that people are sloughing off these unjust and inaccurate and unfair accusations of anti-Semitism. Like, please, just like, I'm not having it. And that didn't used to happen. That the power of that accusation has been diffused in public discourse in the United States to a considerable extent. And once things get rolling, they can change very quickly. And I will just end by saying, I've met with people from the ANC, the African National Congress, shortly after the liberation of South Africa from apartheid. And they told me, you're doing great. You're ahead of where we are, they actually said. And when, in 1990, 1991, and of course the shift, the fall of apartheid was in 1994. When in those, like 2 or 3 years before, we didn't see it coming. We thought we were going to be in it for another few decades, and boom, it happened. So I see the possibility for fairly rapid change in the big picture. Am I predicting that it will happen? No, but I will say that it could happen, and to some extent, it depends on our agency.
Well, that's why we remain prisoners of hope. We do the work, we struggle, we fight, and we know
We
that
do.
victory will come, if not in our lifetime, certainly soon thereafter. And so the struggle continues. George
Right.
Bisharat, thank you so much for hanging out with us on Night School.
Appreciate it. Thanks so
Uh,
much, Mark. Nice to be with you.
you too. We'll talk soon. All right, family. That was a masterclass we just got. I mean, really historical analysis, deep legal analysis, profound. And it was also filled with considerable amounts of hope. And we're going to wrap up in a second, but I did want to take a second to answer Delulu's question, which is, why does IHRA definition of Semitism have power? Why is it given power? And it's a great question. And if you have other questions, I'll do my best to answer them. The reason is because of lobbying. The IHRA definition is a definition that is helpful to the ADL. It's helpful to Israeli lobbying groups. And again, Israel is not the only country with a lobby. It's not the only cause with a lobby. There's lobbies for everything from sugar to beef to guns to pro-life. So Israel shouldn't be held to a different standard in terms of understanding that there's going to be a lobby, but understanding how that lobby works. There have been demands for Congress to pass into law the IHRA definition for several years now, numerous years now, and it just didn't get traction. But now that there's a thing happening all around the country that people are responding to, I'm talking about the campus activism, in addition to the tragedy of October 7th, there's simply political room for this conversation now in a way that there wasn't before. And so there's lobbying and there's pushing, and then it gets through the House of Representatives, and then it goes to the Senate, where I hope George is right and that I'm wrong. I hope there's some reasonable people in the Senate who don't pass this. But if they do, this will be a testament to organizing, right-wing organizing, Zionist organizing, all of it. And so that's why you see the response that you see. Everybody, I want to thank y'all for joining me tonight. I want to shout out the people who, have made this session extraordinary. I want to shout out all the people who bought memberships. We saw over a dozen memberships get purchased tonight, which again helps to build and grow this channel. I'm so grateful for it. If you enjoyed Night School tonight, please hit the like button right now. Did y'all enjoy that? Again, this brother broke it down. His brother gave us such deep analysis, such powerful insights. Hit the like button if you were rocking with what he was saying. Even if you don't agree with all of it, just that he gave us his time and his energy. This is what Night School is in a nutshell. Also, of course, hit the subscribe button. There's some people in this room who I know have not subscribed to the channel, but you absolutely should, so you can get all the updates for all the content that we got rolling, including new episodes of The Classroom in the Cell. And I know Princess is going to be happy because I sent her like 74 episodes today. So we're gonna be checking them out. There are all kinds of ways to support the channel. You can join the channel. We ask that you join so you can become a monthly subscriber. It allows us to build and to grow. We see people doing that right now. Look at that. Chef Shaya coming through with 10 MLH memberships. We got M coming through with 5. I appreciate y'all. I'm so grateful to y'all for doing this. This is no small thing. I don't think of it as a small thing. I truly appreciate it. We could also give you some new directions. Look at this beautiful graphic that's posted right, chump. Cash App, MLHTV, PayPal.me, TVMLH, Venmo at MLHTV, and Zelle, MLH at MLHTV.com. You can shoot us all kinds of support through those different platforms. Whatever platform works for you, do it. You always hit me up before, like, I'd love to donate, but I need you to have Zelle. There's Zelle there. Some people say, oh, I need PayPal. I'm international. There's PayPal. And Cash App and Venmo been there for a couple of weeks, so feel free to use those platforms to make donations of whatever amount you want to the channel. Some of y'all want to do food stamps. I will figure out how to get the access card wired so that y'all can make that happen, yo. Whatever it takes. Shout out to you, Lindsay Jolly, by the way, who just became a channel member. And I see a super chat coming in from Omega, who's one of our big supporters, who I'm so grateful for. She said, many of us were not fully aware of the Palestinian cause before. To finally garner our impassioned support, what alternatives would you suggest to Hamas to avoid a 10-7? Negotiating, pleading for global intervention wasn't working. I think that's a complicated question. And of course, the baby starts crying right as you ask that question. But I want to give a quick answer. I think the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement is critical. I think nonviolent boycott, divestment, sanction movement is important. I think international resistance through nonviolent means is important. But I also don't ever want to deny Palestinian people the right to armed self-defense. Occupied people have a right to self-defense. They have a right to armed self-defense. So I don't believe that we should be killing civilians. I don't believe that we should be kidnapping civilians. I don't agree with what happened on 10-7, but I also don't want to take armed struggle out of the realm of possibility. So we have to think about that too. You know what? I'm going to do and I may come back later and do an office hours, but I got to get this baby, because as you hear him, he's crying. I'll see y'all later. Thank you for watching Night School. And Omega, I'm gonna give you a deeper and longer answer as well when I come back. But thank you all for watching. We'll see you later. Peace.